Hello, and welcome to this AMS Weather Band presentation on the influence of vegetation on weather and climate. My name is Christopher Skinner. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental, Earth, and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. So in my research, I study how water moves around the atmosphere, starting with the initial transfer of water from Earth's land surface. And so plants are responsible for a substantial portion of this exchange of water. In fact, plants move more water each day than all the discharge from all the world's rivers combined. So the movement of that much water, right, from plants into the atmosphere has tremendous implications for our weather and climate. So in this talk, I'll highlight some of those influences, and then I'll demonstrate how our intentional and unintentional changes to plants are altering our weather and climate. So I'm going to start by taking us back to the summer of 1995. So in July of that year, Chicago experienced one of the deadliest climate disasters in US history. So a heat wave gripped the Midwest for 5 days. With the maximum daytime temperatures in Chicago reaching up to 106 degrees Fahrenheit. And then at night, temperatures only cooled to about 80 degrees Fahrenheit in the city. So the hot temperatures were also accompanied by very, very high levels of humidity, right? So there was a lot of water vapor in the air in addition to the high temperatures. So in the city of Chicago itself, 739 people died of heat-related causes. And so the humidity was a key reason for the numerous hospitalizations and the large death toll in Chicago in this event. So you've heard, or you've probably heard, that it's not the heat, it's the humidity, right? Well, actually, it's both. So when heat and humidity are both high, conditions become dangerous for people. So we use a quantity called the heat index, which combines the air temperature with the relative humidity of the atmosphere to express what the air temperature really feels like. So this color-coded chart from NOAA shows how the combination of temperature on the x-axis here and relative humidity on the y-axis, increasing as you go down, how the combination of those two things can lead to different heat index values and subsequently to different risk levels for heat disorders. And so in Chicago, the heat index reached the danger to extreme danger levels, sort of highlighted in these orange and red colors here. So why is the heat index value, right, a high heat index value, dangerous for people? Well, so when air temperatures are high, your body warms up and it needs to shed that heat, right? So one of the ways that it sheds heat is by sweating, right? So as water passes through the pores on our skin, it evaporates into the air. So it takes a lot of energy to evaporate that liquid water, right? To evaporate that sweat from your skin into the air. And that energy that's required to sort of evaporate that water, that energy comes from your body's heat. So your body provides energy for the sweat to evaporate, and that loss of heat then cools your body down. So now the issue is if there's already a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere, right? For example, if the air is close to saturation, right? If there's high relative humidity, the sweat on your skin is going to evaporate a lot more slowly. And so if it's evaporating more slowly, you don't shed heat as quickly, and your body's temperature doesn't cool down fast enough. This can cause your body to overheat, resulting in sickness and, in some extreme cases, in death. And that's exactly what happened during the 1995 Chicago heat wave. So where did all that humidity during the Chicago heat wave come from? And what does this have to do with plants? So the high humidity during the heat wave was driven by anomalously high evapotranspiration in the surrounding area. So there's a diagram of what evapotranspiration is here on the left, and I'll quickly describe that. What evapotranspiration is it's the flux of water that leaves the Earth's surface and enters the atmosphere. So this can happen when water evaporates from, for example, from the soil on the ground. This would be called ground evaporation. It can happen from lakes and oceans. It can also happen when water is transferred from the soil through plants and then out into the atmosphere, and that's called transpiration. So evapotranspiration is the combination of evaporation and transpiration. I'll discuss transpiration in more detail in a bit. That's sort of a really critical process for this talk. But just for now, the reason why plants transpire, at least one of the reasons, is that it helps to shuttle nutrients throughout the plant. And it's also key for photosynthesis and for regulating plant temperatures. So it's a very ubiquitous process. Okay, so now that we know what evapotranspiration is, on the right is a plot that depicts what evapotranspiration looked like during an afternoon of the 1995 Chicago heatwave event. So this is from July 14th in particular. And so the colored shading here is the evapotranspiration. And so the yellows and oranges are high evapotranspiration. And so you can see very, very high evapotranspiration rates were located just west and southwest of Chicago in the Midwest portion of the country. So this is where the majority of the humidity, right, the water vapor in the air in Chicago was sourced from this region to the south and southwest of the city. And so evapotranspiration was so high during this event because in the previous weeks, right, leading up to the event, it had rained a tremendous amount in the Midwest. And so there was a lot of water from that rain that had seeped into the soils, and that water was then available for evapotranspiration to take place during the heatwave event. So as you might have guessed, transpiration from plants was the primary way in which the soil water from the previous week's rains entered the atmosphere. So corn and soy crops in particular, there's some examples of what those look like here, were the major contributors to high transpiration rates. So on the right is a map that shows the distribution of corn in the central United States and a little bit in the eastern United States as well, with the darker greens indicating greater acreage in that location dedicated to corn. Note this map comes from 2019, but similarly, corn was widespread in the area, to the west and southwest of Chicago in 1995. So given sufficient water in the soil, an acre of corn can transpire anywhere from 3,000 to 4,000 gallons of water to the atmosphere each day. And this is exactly what happened in 1995 during the heatwave event. So you may have seen, headlines in recent years about quote unquote corn sweat, right? So there's a few of them here. Corn sweat may exacerbate heat impact in the Midwest this weekend. Corn sweat adding to heat misery in the Midwest. Corn sweat and how large-scale agriculture is making life a little stickier, right? So what these articles are describing is the transpiration from corn. And as we've seen in recent heatwave events, like those events that are described in these headlines and in the 1995 Chicago event, crops can be a really important contributor to humidity, in some cases to dangerous heat index values. I should note here, though, corn gets all the attention, right? It gets all the headlines because corn sweat is sort of a fun term to say, but corn is not the only crop with high transpiration. And more broadly, all plants are transpiring, right? And all of the plants that transpire are shaping our weather. Okay, so for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the role of plants in weather and climate from the hydrologic perspective, so the water perspective. There are many other directions that we could take this talk, including the role of plants in the carbon cycle, or the really fascinating role of plants in contributing to aerosols in the atmosphere and the subsequent air quality impacts. But for the sake of time, I'll stick with a focus on the hydrologic cycle. So through transpiration, as I mentioned before, plants pump a tremendous amount of water from below ground into the atmosphere. Without plants, right, the soil water would eventually make its way down into streams and rivers, lakes, ponds, the ocean, right, as runoff. But instead, plants don't allow that water to run off. They take that water in through their roots, draw it up through the stem and into the leaves, and release it into the atmosphere wherever those plants are located. So consequently, we need to know where plants are, how much water they move, and when they move it to accurately predict weather and to understand and project our future climate. So the three ways that plants shape our weather and climate through the hydrologic cycle are via changes in humidity, precipitation, and temperature. So we've just run through an example of vegetation's control on humidity, right? The Chicago heat wave event, right? This can be especially impactful during extreme heat events, where the water vapor from plants can raise that heat index value. Similarly, the transfer of water vapor to the atmosphere through plants can influence precipitation, right? And so I'll share some examples of that connection in the next few slides. So there are about 320,000 species of plants right now. And though they are, quite literally rooted in the ground, they are far, far, far from static. So in fact, they are a dynamic, constantly changing surface underneath our atmosphere. So we can see that dynamism in this movie of vegetation distribution during the course of a year. And this is multiple years stitched together. So specifically what is shown here is something called the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. And this comes from NASA's Terra satellite. So what it is it's a measure of the greenness of Earth's landscape. And so plant coverage changes during the year in response to changes in climate and changes in sunlight. So this seasonal variation means that the role of plants in our weather also varies across time and space. It's kind of a mesmerizing animation, but I'll stop it there. So the seasonal phenology, right, the seasonal cycle of plants is reflected in the evolution of transpiration during the year. So these images here show the average transpiration in each season for the North American continent. So a clear seasonal signal emerges, right, with the greatest transpiration rates occurring during the summer season. And that makes sense, right? That's when vegetation coverage is at its peak, as we just saw in the previous animation. So transpiration rates are especially high in summer in relatively wet regions that have dense vegetation cover. So examples would be the eastern and central United States, the Pacific Northwest, and portions of western and central Canada. Naturally, right, summer is the season when plants have the largest overall impact on weather in North America, but it's worth noting that plants can also transpire quite a bit of moisture and therefore influence weather during the spring and fall seasons as well. So the pumping of all this water vapor into the atmosphere by plants directly influences where, when, and how much it rains. So what I'm showing here is an estimate of how dependent North America is on plants for their precipitation. That is, what percentage of all precipitation occurs from water vapor that was released into the atmosphere by plants. So once that water leaves the plant as water vapor, it travels in the atmosphere until it condenses and then falls out as precipitation. So as I mentioned, these results were estimated with the use of a climate model from the National Center for Atmospheric Research. That model and analysis was conducted by a graduate student in my group, Tyler Harrington. And if you want to sort of check out his this work further, you can check out this link here to his paper, which is currently under review. So consistent with the previous transpiration maps, right, we see the largest fractions of precipitation from plants in the summer season, right? The darkest shades of blue are occurring during the summer. And this is when plants are transpiring the most, right? So for much of the northern US and Canada, between 30 and 45% of all the summer precipitation comes directly from plants, right? It's a very substantial fraction. And the maximum reliance of precipitation on plants is found in, or what we find in this model simulation is that it's in the northern plains region of the US and the southern Canadian prairies where you see this darkest blue. But really it's a very important component of precipitation across all of Canada and in the northern United States. So what you'll notice if you think back to the transpiration map from 2 slides ago, right? These aren't necessarily the same regions that had the most summer transpiration, right? So for example, the southeastern US has really, really high transpiration rates in the summer. But the percent of summer precipitation from transpiration in these regions is lower than in these regions to the north and west. And the reason for that is because the southeastern US also receives a very large fraction of their precipitation from the Gulf of Mexico and from the Atlantic Ocean, right? So they're a little bit less reliant on plants for their total precipitation than some of these regions that are a bit more interior, further away from the oceans. So it's these interior and eastern portions of northern North America that need plants to provide a large proportion of their warm season or summer season rain. If plants were to transpire less, or if they were to stop transpiring completely because vegetation dies off, or from a drought or from a pest infestation, these regions would be in a lot of trouble, right? Because they receive such a large fraction of their precipitation from plants. So where else in the world relies really heavily on transpiration for rainfall and therefore for the vitality of their managed and natural systems? Well, the tropical forests are a great example. It's estimated that anywhere from 20 to 30% of all of the precipitation in the Amazon comes directly from trees in the Amazon. We can see this in this satellite-derived visualization from NASA, right? So the visualization here loops over 3 days, and the color shading represents rainfall. So much like you would see on a weather radar on the TV forecast. So you notice that rainfall sort of appears each day, and it sort of appears out of nowhere in this sort of pulsing motion over the Amazon, for example. It's also happening over the Congo as well. So that rain, that sort of appearing out of nowhere, that pulsing, is coming from trees that are transpiring water into the atmosphere above the Amazon. The water vapor in the atmosphere then condenses and falls back down as rain, and then the trees take that water back up through their roots, and that process repeats itself each day. And so that's what that pulsing is exhibiting there. So over the past 40 to 50 years, right, humans have increasingly affected the Amazon, resulting in a forest loss of about 17%. So a lot of that cleared forest has been converted to agricultural land, mostly for pastures, right? So grasslands for grazing. It's estimated that if humans were to deforest most of the Amazon, converting the land from forest to grasslands, kind of like is shown in this photo here, if they were to do that across the Amazon, the estimate is that precipitation would decrease by about 12%. So that's sort of the middle of the road estimate there. Right, so note, grasses and crops would still transpire water, right? This vegetation here is still transpiring water, and that water could then fall down as precipitation again. But because grasses and crops are transpiring less than the trees are, there's going to be less transpiration, less water vapor, and therefore less precipitation. So therefore we see an estimated drop of about 12% of total precipitation. So without this biological transpirational pump, right, operating at its most efficient, right, with these large tropical trees, weather in the world's tropical regions, especially in the tropical forests, would be very different. It would be much, much drier than it is today. Okay, so plants are not only influential for humidity and for precipitation, they also serve as an important control on our temperature at the surface of the Earth. So the following is a side-by-side comparison of land cover type on the left and land surface temperature on the right for the city of Atlanta. I think this is just taken from a sort of a random day during the summertime. These are provided by NASA. So the roads and industrial areas in Atlanta, right, they stand out as red on this map here. And that indicates temperatures, in excess of 28 degrees Celsius. The vegetated areas, on the other hand, are represented by light yellow on this temperature map, right? They're some 8 degrees Celsius cooler than the more industrialized and areas in the roads and things like that. So you may have heard about these temperature contrasts, right, in the context of urban heat islands. And there's a lot of research right now and many efforts across cities to incorporate more trees into urban areas to cool down temperatures. But what's going on here, right? Why are plants able to cool the environment? It isn't just because they provide shade, although that is an important service that plants do provide. But there's more to it there. So to answer that and to understand the potential for trees to cool the environment in the future, we need to dig a bit deeper into the process of transpiration. So as I mentioned earlier quickly, plants transpire for a few reasons. One reason is that nutrients from the soil are brought into the plant when the roots take in water. And then those nutrients are shuttled right to the plant as the water moves from the roots up through the stem and into the leaves. So that's a really important service that the movement of water through a plant provides. But another reason that plants transpire is because they take in CO2, right, carbon dioxide, from the atmosphere for photosynthesis. And they do that through small openings on their leaves called stomata, right? So a single opening is called a stoma. When you refer to multiple openings on a leaf, they're called stomata. So when the stomata open, right, this is an example of what a stomata might look like and the exchange of gases that happens through the stomata. When that stomata opens to take in CO2 for photosynthesis, water evaporates from the interior of the leaf into the atmosphere through that same opening, right? So the evaporation of water through the open stomata is the transpiration, right? It's that evaporation that's happening there. So just like our bodies cool when sweat evaporates through the pores on our skin, the plant's leaves cool down when the water evaporates through the stomata into the atmosphere. All right, so this cooling process along the leaves then cools down the air that's surrounding the plant, and that lowers the atmospheric temperatures at the Earth's surface in regions where there is vegetation present. So this is a major reason that vegetated areas have lower temperatures than non-vegetated areas. And that's why incorporating vegetation into cities and other urban areas can be an effective way to reduce urban heat island effects, as long as the trees have water that they can tap into and then transpire. It's not really much use in planting trees if there isn't water for those trees to access. Okay, so given their role in controlling temperature, if we change the landscape of vegetation, the temperatures will also change, right? So going back to that deforestation example, if we replace tropical forest with grasslands and other crops, that's going to reduce the amount of transpiration, and that reduction in transpiration is going to cause the temperature to rise. So again, if we were to conduct this over basically the entire Amazon all at once, right? Temperatures in the Amazon are expected to warm by about 2 degrees Celsius, right? So that's 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's a substantial warming across a very large region. In fact, this is already happening in the Amazon and other tropical regions today where deforestation is taking place, right? Temperatures are increasing. That's already been observed. Okay, so aside from deforestation though, right, there are other ways that we are altering plants and the amount of transpiration that enters the atmosphere and therefore temperatures. So recall that plants release water to the atmosphere when they open their stomata to take in CO2. So what happens, right, when the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere increases? Well, one consequence of rising atmospheric CO2 is that plants can meet their carbon needs much more easily, and they don't need to open their stomata as widely or as frequently as they did when the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere were lower, right? It's much more easy to meet the CO2 needs they have for photosynthesis if there's a lot of it in the atmosphere. It just sort of diffuses into the leaf much more easily. So they don't need to open their stomata as much or as wide. So you can put that another way. You can say that in the presence of higher atmospheric CO2 concentrations, plants become more efficient with their water use, right? They don't have to let water, or water doesn't have to, water won't escape through the stomata as much if the stomata are closed more of the time. And so this effect has actually been observed in the laboratory and in field experiments in which plants are exposed to higher CO2 concentrations. So an example of one of those field experiments is known as the free air CO2 enrichment experiments, or FACE experiments. And that's an example of one of those experiments is shown here on the left. So I've circled these white rings in these little forest stands here, right? And those white rings, they enclose pipes that are releasing CO2 into the surrounding plants that I've sort of circled in yellow. So then the scientists compare the plant characteristics between the plants that are exposed to the higher CO2 concentrations from these pipes with plants that are just exposed to the ambient levels of CO2, the present day CO2 levels. So plants over here, for example, that are not directly exposed to the higher CO2. Okay, so they compare the plant characteristics in those two sets of plants, right? Holding everything else constant, everything else being equal. So the plot on the right shows the response of plant stomata to the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. So specifically what is shown here is the change in the stomatal conductance, which you can think of as the willingness of the plant to pass water through their stomata. So as you can see, the stomatal conductance decreases in the presence of higher CO2, right? So here's the zero line over on the right, and these are negative changes in stomatal conductance. And these are different crop types here, right? From grasses to trees to shrubs, things like that. So when the stomatal conductance decreases, in most cases, that means that transpiration is also going to decrease, right? Less water passing through the openings on the leaf because those openings are now not as open, right? They're a little bit more closed more frequently, and the opening itself is a little bit more narrow. So of course, there's a number of other factors, right, that are involved here that sort of complicate this relationship, but this is a fairly robust response across many different vegetation species, this reduction in stomatal conductance in the presence of higher CO2. All right, so why do we care about the impacts of CO2 on plants, right? Well, the CO2 concentration, as we all know, in the atmosphere, it's increasing. It's currently in excess of 410 parts per million, and it's projected to increase in the future as well. And so this is a plot of different possible future trajectories of global atmospheric CO2 concentration based on different assumptions of human activity like population growth, energy use, etc. So here's CO2 concentration on the y-axis, and then these are years going out to the year 2100 on the x-axis. So now there are a lot of options, and we could take and we could end up at the end of the century with very different CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, depending on the choices that we make. But we were curious, what might happen to plant physiology and to transpiration if we did indeed take one of these higher CO2 pathways, right? If we continued to emit CO2 into the atmosphere. So we focused on one of these, higher emissions scenarios here, where CO2 basically doubles from the concentration that it's at today, right? So CO2 by the end of the century reaches something like 900 to 950 parts per million in these sort of hypothetical future scenarios. So we wanted to know, what would that do to stomatal conductance and to transpiration? So we used a collection of climate models to explore this idea. I want to stress here that we are not investigating the greenhouse effect, right? When you increase the CO2 concentration, you essentially are trapping more energy, more heat in the system that can raise temperatures, that can change weather patterns, that can change plants as well, right? That's not what I'm talking about in this example. I'm just talking about what would happen to the stomatal conductance, right? The little stomata on the plants if we increase the CO2 concentration to something like 900 parts per million. And then what would happen to things like transpiration in response to that? So just as we see in the FACE experiments, right, those CO2 enrichment experiments in the field, climate models project that transpiration will decrease as the CO2 concentration increases because plants become more efficient with their water use, right? They don't have to open their stomata as much to get that CO2 for photosynthesis. So on the left, that's what this is showing here, right? So CO2 concentration on the x-axis and sort of how transpiration declines over time. For example, the example here is for the tropics. So on the right is a map that shows where those transpiration changes may take place, right? So wherever you see the browns is where transpiration would decrease because the CO2 concentration has increased. And the biggest reductions occur in the regions where we see lots of transpiration today, right? So if you transpire a lot today, the CO2 concentration increases, you're going to transpire much, much less water in the future, potentially. Okay, so as you might expect at this point, right, this reduction in transpiration is going to increase the temperature near the surface of the Earth. And that's exactly what we see in these climate model simulations. So this map, you could choose many different metrics to show this, but this map shows the change in temperature on the hottest day of the year if transpiration were to decrease by 10 to 20%, like we saw on that previous map. So this transpiration effect could raise temperatures by as much as 2 to 3 degrees Celsius in some areas, right? So you can see the reds and the pinks here in the northern latitudes. So again, this highlights the change in temperature just from plants transpiring less because of stomatal conductance changes, right? This is in addition to and aside from any of the temperature changes that we might see from the greenhouse effect. Okay, so again, this just sort of highlights just how important plants can be in keeping temperatures much cooler than they otherwise would be at the surface of the Earth. Right, and as we found in this research, it isn't just the evaporative cooling that keeps temperatures down. We find that as plants transpire less and the temperature near the Earth's surface increases, there are a lot of important feedbacks that also come into play. So one of the most important that we found is that the reduction in transpiration from elevated CO2 that causes temperatures to warm, it also causes humidity levels to drop, right? So it essentially gets a lot drier near the surface of the Earth. And what we found is that warmer, drier atmosphere results in less cloud formation. And with fewer clouds, we actually see more solar energy reaching the surface of the Earth, warming up temperatures even more. So there's a whole set of really complex climate interactions that can take place when plant characteristics change. And we're very much so still learning about all of these interactions. Okay, so as we've seen, vegetation can, its impact on climate and weather is ubiquitous, right? From influences on the total amount of precipitation during the year to influences on individual weather extremes. As such, it's really, really important that we incorporate vegetation and vegetation processes into our weather forecast models, into our seasonal prediction models, and into climate models that are used for future climate projections. So as my last point in this talk, I want to give an example from a recent study that analyzed the impact of incorporating near real-time vegetation characteristics into a weather forecast model. So the researchers, they compared two weather forecasts, same forecasts, with the same model. But what they did was, in one simulation, they used climatological averages of vegetation as the lower boundary condition in their model. So what that means is that for a forecast made for a 3-day period in October, they used average October vegetation characteristics as the land surface in their model. And then in the other simulation run with the same model for the same time period, they updated the vegetation to include the most recent conditions, right? So for example, if the vegetation had dried up, or if the vegetation was really thriving because of a lot of rain in recent weeks, those changes to the vegetation state were incorporated into the vegetation data set that they used in their model forecast. So the map on the left actually shows the changes in vegetation between those two simulations, right? So, somewhat confusingly, the green color here actually represents where the more recent vegetation was actually less healthy, and the reds indicate where the vegetation was really thriving and there was more green vegetation in those locations. So pretty different states here. And on the right is the difference in the forecasted temperature between those two simulations, where the only difference is the updated vegetation. And there are widespread differences in forecasted temperature across the country, right? Some regions are 2 to 3 degrees C warmer, which is just really, really wild, right? And you can actually see in regions where the vegetation had sort of died off, these green colors here, we actually see temperatures quite a bit warmer in the forecast for that simulation, right? So that may be because of transpiration. It may also be because of changes in reflective properties of radiation due to the vegetation. But really, really highlights just how important vegetation and updating the vegetation data sets that we have can be for accurate weather forecasts. Okay, so I've reached the end of the presentation. I've focused here on plants' role as a biological water pump, right? That just releases tremendous amounts of water into the atmosphere. And that impacts humidity, temperature, and precipitation. So there are countless other examples of ways in which plants can sort of shape our weather and climate. A really big connection that I didn't even touch on really is the connection through the carbon cycle. But that should be left for another talk in and of itself. So as we modify our landscapes, right, through deforestation, afforestation, agriculture, irrigation, etc., we are actively changing our weather. So vegetation will continue to change as CO2 concentration rise, and as temperature and precipitation patterns change as the climate changes. And those vegetation changes in response to those things are then going to further influence our weather and climate. Right, so the hope and the goal of studying plant influences on weather and climate is that this work can help inform our future land use decisions, right? This is a very active area of research in meteorology and in climate science, and one that needs more resources and more people, both on the observational side doing field work and on the modeling side. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators here, Tyler, Justin, Jesse, and Chris, and the funding agencies that have supported some of the work on this topic from NSF and NOAA. And with that, I just want to say thank you very much for listening. And if you have questions, please feel free to get in contact with me through email, and I'll do my best to get back to you. Thank you.